Hey guys, and welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, my name's Georgia, and on my platforms here on the internet, I mostly cover unsolved true crime. Today's case is one that you've likely never heard of before because as far as I could find, there aren't any other videos about this case on YouTube. There are only a couple of podcast episodes, I couldn't find any documentaries, and there aren't even really any threads on Reddit. This is a case that was really well covered at the time it happened. I found plenty of newspaper articles to pull from for this, but it does seem like it may have fallen to the wayside over the years. Somebody was convicted of this crime in 1947, but he was exonerated in 1983. And it seems like Sarah's case has been overshadowed by the exoneration because now people talk about that rather than talk about her. And to this day, no one else has ever been arrested for her murder. Sarah Ann Ottens was born on the 9th of February 1953 to her parents Robert and Myra Ottens in Morrison, Illinois, which is where she would grow up as the oldest of 5 children. Her younger sister Susan told Sarah Weinman for The Guardian back in 2016, quote, "I idolised Sarah. She forged the way for me in life. She was very outgoing and social. I was the opposite. I was very shy, withdrawn. I looked up to her for advice," unquote. Sarah had plenty of friends in life and also plenty of hobbies. She was a very busy woman. At Morrison High School, she was involved in the drama club, the school newspaper, the radio station, and the yearbook. She was an organiser, she was a planner, she thrived off of stuff like this. She was also a big reader, she always had a book in her face. One wonders how she'd have time for all of this, but she did. She absolutely loved it. She loved a busy life. And the only area of her life that she wasn't busy in was her love life, according to her friends. She just wasn't really interested in romance or dating. No one can recall her ever dating anyone, and she was incredibly happy that way. According to the aforementioned Guardian article, Sarah naturally had very sort of fine, murky blonde hair that she absolutely hated. No matter what she did with it, it never looked how she wanted it to look. So on the day of her high school graduation photo, she actually hid her hair with a short, dark brown wig, with the hairstyle being very sort of typical of this time. When Sarah was murdered, this photo with the fake hair, the wig, became the one that was widely circulated of her. But it's really funny to think that in life, that's not really what Sarah would look like on a day-to-day basis. I say that to say that this was the type of person where if she wasn't happy with something, she was going to fix it, she was going to change it, she was going to make it work for her. Which, from what I found out about her, just about seems to sum her up perfectly. Sarah was just 20 years old. She was going to do incredible things with her life. As high school came to an end, Sarah decided that she wanted a career as a nurse. So in true Sarah style, she worked really hard to make that a reality. She originally headed to St. Francis College in Peoria, I assume I'm saying that right, before transferring to the University of Iowa, which was just over the state line and only about 90 minutes away from her family home. She moved into room 408 at Reinau Hall, or it might be pronounced Raynau Hall. I couldn't actually find it pronounced out loud anywhere, so anybody who goes to the University of Iowa, please feel free to correct me in the comments. It's a 12-storey tower constructed in 1966, so just 7 years before the events of 1973, so it was all new and shiny and modern. It wasn't really the kind of place where terrible things happened. And Sarah went off to university and she thrived. She was incredibly focused on her studies and she was a very conscientious student. She was intent on becoming this nurse upon graduation. So much so that when spring break of 1973 rolled around and all of her friends were planning to go to Mexico, she decided to stay back, saying she had to work and needed the money. In term time, she tended to work at the University Hospital School cafeteria on Mondays and Tuesdays, but in the break from school, she booked in an extra shift and then made plans to see her family. Her mum Myra later saying that her and Sarah's grandparents had plans to head to Iowa City to pick Sarah up and then they were going to head out for dinner and then go back home. When they spoke late on the Monday evening, Myra said Sarah seemed very happy and excited to see her later in the week, but of course they would never get that opportunity. Now, only a few students stayed back at Reinau Hall during the spring break and only 2 stayed on the 4th floor, meaning that Sarah pretty much had her run of the place. In those few days, she took to sleeping in her friend's room, room 429, because they had a television and a radio. It was a room that students would often hang out in term time, and why wouldn't Sarah make the most of it whilst her friends were away and she could? It was around 11:45 p.m. on Tuesday the 13th of March 1973 when two other remaining residents of Rynell Hall, Brenda Simpson and George Proctor, returned to the fourth floor from watching a movie. They were making their way back to Brenda's room when they walked past room 429 and they noticed the door ever so slightly ajar, something telling them to take a peek inside. And when they do, they find a sight that no one ever wants to see. They saw Sarah lying face down on the floor with a clean sheet covering her body. She was naked from the waist down with her clothes strewn across the room. She was covered in bruises on her chest, face and neck, which was also incredibly swollen. Next to her body they found a broom handle. And although it was very clear from just seeing her that she had passed away, George took her wrist to feel for a pulse, finding it cold to the touch. Clearly, Sarah had already been dead for a significant period of time. And so obviously the pair go straight to alert the campus police, who subsequently bring in both the city and state police. Upon analysis of the scene, investigators found that very strangely the killer had washed Sarah's face and hair, leaving bloody water in the sink of the room. Now, it was very clear from the offset that this was definitely a case of murder, and although the Iowa City Press-Citizen reported at the time that the exact cause of death wasn't immediately given, the autopsy would soon reveal that she died of asphyxiation by strangulation, with the murderer likely holding a broom handle to her throat. Remember, the broom handle was found right next to her body. Medical testimony at the later trial would confirm that such a manoeuvre could cause death within just a single minute. And alongside this, she had also been brutally beaten and assaulted. And despite her state of undress, it would be said at trial that there was no evidence of sexual attack. Now, this is really interesting, as most sources for this case do state that there was sexual assault, the thought being that it just wasn't mentioned by authorities at the time because of it being this big taboo back in the 70s. But looking at the official trial document, they do state very blatantly that there just wasn't any. However, of course, we do know that sexual assault doesn't always leave evidence behind, especially maybe not evidence that could have been deciphered back in 1973, and this may well still have been a sexually motivated attack without an actual sexual assault taking place. All sources do seem to agree at the very least that the attack was sexually motivated. Now, this confusion may come from the fact that Sarah's parents were actually told that she was raped. At 3 a.m. on the Wednesday, just a few hours after the discovery of her body, a call was made to the Ottens house where Dr. T.T. Bozek, the coroner of Johnson County, asked to speak to Mr. Ottens. Susan, who was Sarah's younger sister, was actually the one who picked up and said that her father was out of town, and she asked, was Sarah dead? To which Bozek replied that she had been raped and beaten to death. Then he asked if she knew anyone who might have wanted to do this to Sarah. Yeah, tact seemed to be something that Bozek was lacking. Sarah woke up her twin brother Sam, and together they had to have the job of telling their mother that Sarah was dead. Now, this phone call came just over 3 hours after Sarah had been discovered by George and Brenda, so I highly doubt the autopsy had already taken place by this point, although I am happy to be corrected if anyone knows any different. So my best guess is that Bozek was making an assumption based on the appearance of the body at this time, but when the autopsy actually took place, no evidence of this could be found. I mean, this does seem to be the only thing that makes any sense because, again, according to the official trial documents, there was no evidence of sexual assault. All in all, the investigation in the immediate aftermath was just incredibly poor. In terms of evidence, they found one single fingerprint on the faucet in the sink, and then investigators just allowed a number of random people in the room, namely the media who got access to the crime scene before it was secured. There is no quicker way to ensure that your crime scene is contaminated than to let a load of random people just traipse around. From that moment on, this case was destined to become unsolved, because even if you do find evidence, how is that ever going to hold up in court? Months passed in this case with no arrest, seemingly very little movement. Sarah's family said they found it an incredibly traumatising time, knowing that Sarah's killer was just out there free somewhere living his life. Whispers flew around the University of Iowa about what had happened, about who the suspects were. And then, after a 6-month investigation, on the 19th September 1973, 19-year-old James Wendell Hall was arrested for the murder. James was this big football star on campus. He was well liked by fellow students. He was studying part-time and he lived in Slater Hall, which was a dorm just across the street from Rhinow Hall. It's also important to note that James is a black man. Investigators' attention turned to Hall when an eyewitness placed him in Rhinow that evening, and then the fingerprint found on the faucet allegedly matched his. When a search of Hall's own dorm was conducted, a pair of tennis shoes were uncovered that were suspected of being bloodstained, and then under the laces they found a hair that was found to be consistent with hair samples taken from Sarah. At face value, this all seems like it might be pretty solid evidence, but Hall has strongly protested his innocence. After his arrest, a bond hearing was held, which was attended by a large support group of his, featuring many of Iowa's black community and many fellow athletes. Very few people in the community believed that he was responsible for such a vicious crime. His bail was set at $50,000, which was an amount that he simply couldn't raise, so he remained in jail until his trial. And then in December, he also ended up being charged with forgery in an entirely separate case. The trial wouldn't begin until May 1974, where the prosecution introduced their evidence. Now, the hair was the strongest thing they had. The Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation lab said the hair on the tennis shoe matched Sarah's, and they also found hair on Sarah's body that matched James Hall's. Considering this was the 1970s, modern technology like today's technology couldn't be utilised to confirm this as being 100% the case. This was mostly done by eye and with expert opinions. So although they said it did match, it wasn't conclusive, although it was damning. In their opening statement, the prosecution also mentioned the fingerprint on the faucet did match Hall's, but then they never actually introduced it in evidence. They also didn't hand over this evidence to the defence lawyer at any point. So the question is, did the fingerprint really match? We don't know. And witness testimony was equally as questionable. Robert Dean Jones, a student at the university living in Rhinow Hall, testified that he rode the elevator with Sarah on the afternoon of her murder, alongside an unidentified white male. Elsie Barnes also verified this, saying she saw Sarah in the elevator with a companion, but didn't pay any attention to anything about them. Repairman John Redding was working on the elevators that day, and he testified that he also saw a woman of Sarah's description on the elevator with, again, a companion. But he said that he'd broken his glasses, and so his vision wasn't all that great. He couldn't see a thing, so he, again, couldn't describe anything about this companion. Cleaning lady Rosemary Jones would say that she saw a black man knocking on Sarah's door that afternoon, but rumour has it that she later admitted to lying in her testimony. All in all, the witness testimonies were very shaky at best, and nothing directly implicated James Hall. Despite this, after a 2-week trial, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 50 years in prison by, importantly, an all-white jury. After the trial, the James Hall Defence Fund and Citizens Concerned for Justice took to the streets and to the university campus to protest and pass around leaflets, saying that racial attitudes may have entered in Hall's conviction by the all-white jury, and that he was convicted before the trial had even began. I mean, Sarah was a white woman and a black man is the suspect. If you're looking historically at very similar court cases, whether guilty or not, James Hall was never going to stand much of a chance of a proper trial. I mean, at trial, the prosecutor was even blatantly racist. He said at one point that Hall won't go with black girls, he will only go with white girls, which is interesting. Maybe there's something wrong with the man. Appeals started very soon after conviction on the grounds of improper admission of evidence and the suppression of exculpatory evidence. And very soon after, witnesses started to come forward, claiming that most of the jurors had drunk alcohol with their dinner before going back to deliberate for 2 hours and finding Hall guilty. But that, it turns out, would only be the tip of the iceberg. As I said, one of the grounds of the appeal was that exculpatory evidence had been intentionally withheld from the defence. For example, the defence found that the jury hadn't been made aware that the witnesses had made a positive identification of somebody who was not James Hall. Rosemary Jones, the cleaner, positively identified a man called William Burbage as being the man that she had seen in the hall that afternoon. And then later on, another witness called Joanna Schleiter also identified Burbage. This fact wasn't revealed to the defence at any point, nor was the fact that neither of these women were able to pick out a photo of James in a lineup. The prosecutor was very clever in this case, although clearly dishonest. He stated to the jury that Hall denied knowing Sarah, saying that he'd never met her, whilst also stating in the same breath that his fingerprint was found in the room in which Sarah died. Now, like I said, this fingerprint evidence was never fully presented in court, as in the end it was thought to be inconclusive, but this put forth the idea that Hall was a liar. He can't possibly have not known Sarah and his fingerprint being found in this room. The Iowa District Court would later say the importance of this twisting of words cannot be overstated, considering that the entire case against Hall was based on circumstantial proof. The outcome of these early appeals wasn't great. The court did affirm the verdict, but they did say they'd look into the allegations around the suppression of evidence. The district court then overruled motions for a new trial. A second appeal to the Iowa Supreme Court again just affirmed the verdict. And then when it came to the US Supreme Court, they refused to even hear the case. And so James Hall remained in prison until he was released on bail in November 1982, just 8 years into his sentence. Just the year before this, the Johnson County Attorney's Office released their documents in regards to this case for the very first time, and it was only at this point that the true extent of the cover-ups were realised. Up until this point, no one had any idea that there had been any other suspects besides James Hall, nor that the suspect had actually been identified in a photo lineup by Rosemary Jones, who then turned around at trial and said that instead she definitely saw James Hall. Another suspect, or maybe it was also Burbage, the details really aren't clear, apparently also knew many unpublished details about this crime, and this was a suspect who had previously been suspected of 3 sexual assaults on campus. Apparently this suspect was discarded when he had just simply an alibi from a girlfriend, and no further investigation was done after that point. All of this new evidence formed the basis for a new application to the Johnson County District Court requesting a new trial, something that was granted on November 22, 1983, with the new trial scheduled to take place in May 1984, so 10 years after the first. At the same time, they also filed a motion to set aside the original indictment on the basis of the newly found evidence, and this was also granted. So, with the original indictment now disregarded, the new trial couldn't take place until a new grand jury returned with a new indictment. But with all this evidence now laid out in front of them, the evidence of other possible suspects, the lack of any solid forensic evidence, the grand jury refused to indict him, and the Attorney General's office was forced to drop the prosecution. The new judge on this case, Vern Robinson, was apparently made furious by it when it came in front of him. He said, "It would seem that ethical considerations were not only overlooked in this case, but completely ignored. This court, in good conscience, cannot allow an indictment to stand when its fabric has been interwoven with withholding of material evidence, false testimony, and racist remarks." It was unbelievable to Judge Robinson that such racism had been allowed in the courtroom, but also generally just such poor prosecution, so many lies and half-truths. Myra Ottens, Sarah's mum, would later say that she'd always believed that James Hall was guilty. She'd taken the trial at face value, he was found guilty by a jury, there was evidence presented, that's that. She said that when she received the call to say that his conviction had been overturned, she was absolutely blindsided. I don't think that Ottens ever considered that he could be innocent, and law enforcement just didn't really keep them in the loop, so they didn't see this coming. I can imagine it was a complete blow for them, old wounds just being reopened time and time again. With James Hall's release, no one else has ever been arrested for Sarah's murder, but this case does remain open. Now, Hall later filed a $3 million lawsuit against the detectives and former attorney, which would settle for $60,000 in the end. He would then go on to continue with his life. He got married, he had a kid, he got a good job. And I wish I could tell you that that is where his story ends, that he went on to live a law-abiding, happy life, but that wasn't the case. Because years later, he ended up back in prison for an entirely separate murder. On the 20th of March 1992, the body of 31-year-old Susan Hajek was found in her bedroom in Cedar Rapids. Her cause of death was strangulation, although once again, poor investigation meant that her death was at first disregarded as a drug overdose. In a very strange mirroring of Sarah's case, the crime scene of Susan's murder was also not secured. It took the police 3 days to look at it for evidence, and in that time her family had cleaned everything up because, like I said, it was first disregarded as a drug overdose. When the attention turned to Hall once again for this crime, he was able to use this quite successfully in his defence. He had been the one to discover Susan's body alongside his girlfriend, Deborah Mayfield, a story that Deborah did originally back up, although she would later change her story just days later, saying that she had been alone in bed when at midnight James came in and asked her to come with him, saying that if she didn't, he was a dead man. He then led her straight to Susan's body. Now, he was arrested on the 17th of August for Susan's murder, but according to the Guardian article that I keep referencing, he told the Cedar Rapids Gazette just a few days later, "I found the body, I have this history, I'm convenient. In my heart of hearts, I know that if the prosecutors want to tailor a case to fit me, they can do it." The prosecution once again claimed at trial that this was a sexually motivated murder. Susan and Hall would often smoke crack together, and when Susan turned down Hall's advances, he got mad. Apparently, he told a friend that he knew of a white woman who'd have sex with you if she was high, and the rejection this time caused Hall to kill her. Yeah, the parallels to Sarah's case are pretty undeniable, but the jury actually wasn't allowed to know about Hall's history in this trial. The judges did rule against it, so they didn't know this. After 15 hours of deliberation on the 23rd of April 1995, Hall was convicted of murder once again, this time for that of Susan Hajek, and this time he was sentenced to life in prison. The Ottens said they were overjoyed to hear about the second conviction, with Sam saying it was bullshit on the system to let this guy go and he does it again. Hall still protests his innocence in both cases, and he's still appealing the conviction, saying he'll continue as long as it takes to get justice. Now, I must admit, a wrongful conviction once is one thing, but twice? Like, does he have a point that he was just a very good suspect for law enforcement when it came to the second murder? But again, the murders were so undeniably similar: asphyxiation, strangulation, sexually motivated. If Hall is innocent, he must be the unluckiest man in the world. The question is, if the original investigation had been done properly in Sarah's case, could the prosecution have had a genuine case against Hall? If they hadn't made the racially motivated comments, could the judge have decided to file another indictment? What about if instead of having this laser focus on Hall as a suspect, investigators had followed the other suspect leads through to the end? Would Susan still be alive? There's no way of knowing. I'm really not sure what my instincts are telling me in this case. If Hall hadn't been convicted of Sarah's murder decades later, I would probably think that he was wrongfully convicted for Sarah's murder. But what's that saying about fool me once, fool me twice? Although I suppose it is worth bearing in mind that regardless of his guilt or innocence, if the due processes weren't followed in the original investigation, then I do agree that his conviction shouldn't stand. We've got to follow the processes of the law, the process of justice. This should just be an incentive for police departments to do their job properly. As I said previously, Sarah's case is still open, but we don't really know what's being done nowadays to try and solve it, if anything. However, there is apparently a possibility that if new evidence came to light about Hall's involvement in her murder, he could be indicted again. However, I suspect that's incredibly unlikely. If you have any information regarding the murder of Sarah Ann Ottens, you're asked to contact the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. I'll leave the contact details in the description box down below, as always. Once again, we have a case in which the victim, Sarah, has been overshadowed by the potential perpetrator, by James Hall. He, like I said throughout this, has still been protesting his innocence. He says that he's not guilty of either murder of which he has been convicted. But is that the case? There's no way of knowing. I would love to see Sarah's case reopened properly. I would love to see brand new investigators, fresh eyes, go over it from the very beginning, because Sarah deserves proper justice and so do her family. Everyone deserves to know what happened in this case. This was a horrible, brutal murder, and that's been completely overshadowed by everything that happened afterwards. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and thank you for choosing to spend this time with me and with Sarah. I appreciate it so much. If you like what I'm doing here on my platforms, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening on my podcast, please make sure you follow and try and boost this content in any way you can. And I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.